this week's lesson. I'm Brian Vermeer, and before we start, I'd like to say that if you enjoy these videos, please like, subscribe, leave comments. Be sure you follow the Facebook page, Mr. Vermeer's Class, and subscribe to the YouTube page, Mr. Vermeer's Class. And click for notifications so that way you'll know when new videos are posted, and you may be able to see them before I make the announcement that they're out. So we are continuing our series on the Olivet Discourse. This is a talk that Jesus gave to his disciples a few days before he was crucified. They had asked him a question, what is going to be the sign of your return? And Jesus is telling them what are the things to look for before he returns to earth to set up his kingdom. Last week he talked about things such as false prophets, false messiahs, earthquakes in various places, and so on. And he mentioned that those are just the beginnings of the birth pains. So that when we see those, and we're already seeing a lot of those, that doesn't mean that the end is going to be right around the corner. That just is the signal that the end is coming. It could still be quite a while. So, now he's going to go into a bit more serious topic. He's going to talk about something that's going to happen, and when it happens, then we know that this is the end. So let's look in Matthew chapter 24. We're going to start with verse 15 and look at verses 15 and 16. He says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then those in Judea must flee to the mountains." First of all, I'd like to mention this little note that's in the parentheses there. Let the reader understand. This is not the words of Jesus. I don't think Jesus spoke in parentheses. This is a footnote put in, or a little marginal note probably, put in either by Matthew himself when he first wrote his gospel, or very likely by one of the people back in the first, second, third centuries maybe, when they were recopying the gospel. Back then all copies had to be made by hand, and it's possible that when one of the people was copying the book of Matthew, so that way he could give a copy to somebody else, he saw that statement and he realized that statement is so important he wanted to make sure people paid attention to it, so probably in the margin he just wrote, "Let the reader understand." And then somewhere along the line, as that copy got recopied and so on, eventually that marginal note kept getting copied along with it and was probably eventually put into the passage here. We leave it in there because we don't know whether that was something a copyist did or something that Matthew himself may have done. And it doesn't really make a difference whether it's in there or not. It's not one of those things that our theology depends upon. So, but it does mean we do need to pay attention to what Jesus is saying here. He's referring to something called the Abomination of Desolation. Now this refers to three events in past and future history. One of these had already occurred at the time Jesus was talking. One would happen 40 years after Jesus gives this talk, and one is still yet to come. So when Jesus is referring to this, he's referring probably both to the one that will happen 40 years from now, which his disciples are still going to be around to see, and the one that's going to occur right before he returns. Now he says, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Daniel also had a lot to say about the end times. And that's one reason why we believe this is referring to the end times, because I'll read this passage from Daniel in a few minutes, and we'll know that this refers to something that's going to occur. But first of all, what is the Abomination of Desolation? What does this mean? The Abomination of Desolation is a term that the Jews gave to a desecration of their temple. And there are three, as I said, specific events that this could refer to. Two of them have already happened by now. The first one occurred in about 168 BC. This is during the time in between the two testaments. You can read about this in the apocryphal books of Maccabees, We can read about this in the writings of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian. And this was during a time that the Greeks were in control of the nation of Israel before the Romans came in and conquered it. And the governor in Israel at that time was a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And according to the Jewish historians, he was very evil. And one of the things that he allegedly did, or at least did according to the historians, was that he went into the Jewish temple, which only Jewish people are allowed to go into, and he rededicated the temple to the god Zeus. Now that is bad enough in the Jewish eyes. He possibly went into the Holy of Holies, which is very bad in Jewish eyes because according to the law of Moses, only the high priest could go in there, and then only once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And to make matters worse, he also allegedly sacrificed a pig on their burnt offering altar. And pigs, as you know, are unclean according to the law of Moses. So this was also a desecration of their altar. This was a desecration of their entire temple. And this was the last straw as far as the Jews were concerned. And a man named Judas Maccabeus led a revolt, and they overthrew the Greeks in Israel and drove them out. And according to the story, when they went back in to clean up the temple and rededicate the temple, one of the items in the temple was a lampstand with 7 branches on it. Today you recognize that as the menorah. And when they went to put oil back in the lampstand to relight the lamps, they saw that they only had enough oil for one day. They decided to put their faith in God, and they went ahead and relit the lamps anyway. And miraculously, God allowed the lamps to keep burning for 8 days until they could get some more oil brought in. And the Jews, ever since then, have celebrated this as the festival of Hanukkah. So, in the month of December, which is when this occurred, when the Jews celebrate their festival of Hanukkah, that is not the Jewish Christmas. It does happen to fall around the Christmas holiday, but it is nowhere near the same thing. That is a holiday they have, and it lasts for 8 days, and it commemorates the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem. So that was the first abomination of desolation, when Antiochus went in and desecrated the Jewish temple. The second one would occur 40 years after Jesus gives this talk to the disciples. In AD 70, the Roman general Titus came into Jerusalem and completely conquered the city, completely destroyed the city. And it is said that he went into the temple to find out what it was that the Jews were worshiping. He didn't understand the Jewish religion at all. So he walked up and went past the veil into the Holy of Holies and was very surprised to find that there was nothing there. The Ark of the Covenant had already been removed at some time in the past. We don't know exactly when, most likely during the Babylonian exile, several hundred years before. And that he was amazed by that they could worship nothing, or at least worship something that they couldn't see. They didn't have an idol. That's what he was expecting to find in there. But then he had the temple completely demolished. And we talked about this last time when we said that the disciples were showing the temple off to Jesus, talking about how beautiful it was. And Jesus said, "I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another." And the temple was completely destroyed. The Wailing Wall today is all that is left of it. And that's just a very small portion of the extreme outer wall, which wasn't even a part of the actual temple. It was just put there to keep non-Jewish people out. So that's the second abomination of desolation, and that could be what Jesus is referring to here. And I'll talk about why here in just a second. But there's a third abomination of desolation that is to come, and that is the one that is spoken of by the prophet Daniel. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, if you'll let me go ahead and read that, it says, "He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering, and the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple, until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator." So who is this he? This he is the person that we refer to today as the Antichrist, the coming world leader. It says he'll make a covenant with many for 1 week. He's going to pass a treaty with Israel for 7 years. And for 7 years, he says he's going to allow the Jews to restart their temple sacrifices, restart their offerings according to the law of Moses. And the Jews are going to. The temple is going to be rebuilt. They're going to restart their sacrifices. During this time, God is going to be specifically dealing with the Jews. This 7-year period is what we refer to as the tribulation that is to come, a time of God's coming judgment on the earth. But in the middle of the week, it says, or 3.5 years into the tribulation, 3.5 years after he signs this treaty, he's going to break his own treaty. And he's going to put a stop to their sacrifices. And Revelation 13 says he's going to go so far as to have a statue of himself set up and require everyone in the world to worship that statue. And I think he's going to have that statue placed in the Holy of Holies of the new Jewish temple. So that also is an abomination of desolation, and I think that's also one that Jesus is referring to. So here he can actually be referring to both the coming one 40 years from after he gives this talk in AD 70. Also, he's referring definitely to the one in the future because he says, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. He says, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Now we know that after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, many of the Jewish people did actually flee to the mountains. In AD 70, there was at least one group of Jews that escaped, and 967 Jewish people fled to the mountains of the Dead Sea and took refuge in a fortress called Masada. And there should be a picture of Masada up right now that you can look at. They held out against the Romans for 3 more years. But then the Romans built a siege ramp up the side of the mountain, because this mountain was very hard to get to, and you can see that ramp on the right side of the picture. And they brought a siege tower up that ramp and finally broke through the doors to the fortress. This fortress had actually been built by Herod the Great as a place that he could use as a summer retreat or anytime he wanted to get away from Jerusalem. So it was well stocked with provisions, it had plenty of food and water, and they were actually living fairly comfortably there. But the Romans finally broke through, and according to, again, Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, of the 967 people who escaped there, when the Romans broke in, they only found 2 women and 5 children left alive. Everyone else, according to the women and children, had killed themselves. The men had taken the knife to their own families, and then they drew lots and killed each other, and then the last one killed himself. Their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, told them to make sure and leave all the supplies they had still there. He said that's to show the Romans that we didn't die because we ran out of food and water. We didn't kill ourselves because we ran out of supplies. We still had plenty. We killed ourselves because we would rather die than live as Roman slaves. So that's an account of Jewish people actually fleeing to the mountains when they saw the abomination of desolation. This is going to happen again. And Jesus is saying, when it happens, literally, run to the hills. Because it's going to get very bad. Let's continue now back in Matthew chapter 24 and look at verses 17 through 20. Jesus says, a man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house. And a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. When this abomination comes, it happened in the time of the Romans, and when it happens again, this conquering of Jerusalem is going to be so quick that if you're on the roof of your house, and the Jews had, their roofs were designed to be places that you could perform activities on, you could do things up there. So it wouldn't be unusual to see Jews on the roofs of their house. But it's going to come so quick that if you happen to be on the roof of your house, don't take the time to go back into your house to get anything. If you're out in your farm, plowing your field, don't take time to go back to your home and get anything. Down south here, we have tornado season every year. And we tell our kids and we tell our families, when a tornado is coming, immediately take shelter. Don't take time to grab things. Don't take time to gather up your stuff, because it could happen so fast that you don't have time to get all your stuff. And your life is worth more than your stuff. So Jesus is saying, when this comes, it's going to be such a great disaster that you won't have time to go back and save anything. Just run. Get out of your house. Run to the mountains. Find safety somewhere. Just get away. Because things are going to get very, very bad. After this abomination occurs, if you read the book of Revelation, there's going to be a horrible time on the earth. God is going to pour his bowls of wrath on the earth. This is a time of judgment on the earth and its people for their sins against him. Jesus said it's going to be so bad, he says, woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers. Now, he's not putting down pregnant women and nursing mothers. He is certainly not discouraging women from getting pregnant and nursing their children. He's just saying it's going to be so bad that if you have anything that can keep you from escaping, you're going to be in trouble. Pregnant women, as you know, cannot get around as easily. Nursing mothers may not have time to stop and nurse their children while they're escaping. And that's the only reason he's saying this. He's simply saying, he could have easily said, woe to handicapped people. Woe to people with disabilities. Woe to people, today we might say, who don't have cars. Because they can't get away as easily or as quickly. And they're going to be caught. He says, pray that your escape may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Because Jesus at this time did not know when this is going to occur. When Jesus came to earth, he put aside many of his godly attributes. And we know that because we know that while Jesus was on earth, he got hungry, he felt pain, he felt sadness. All these things that are human weaknesses, Jesus took on himself when he took a human body. And one of the things that he gave up when he came to earth was his omniscience. Now that simply means, God's ability to know everything. Jesus did not know everything while he was on earth. He knew a lot. He knew what God wanted him to know. But at this time, at least, he did not know when his return was going to be. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in the coming weeks. So he says, pray that it won't be during the winter, because winters in Israel were pretty bad. It can be very rainy. Roads get very, very muddy. It could be, there could be a lot of snow, just bad weather. Pray that there's no bad weather when you're trying to escape. And pray that it won't be on a Sabbath for a couple of reasons. First of all, because you'd be breaking the Jewish law by traveling more than about 6/10 of a mile on the Sabbath. Now you may say, well, certainly God will put an exception to that. But also on the Sabbath, while you're escaping, you're not going to find any place to restock your supplies, because everything's going to be closed, because people aren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. Again, if you live in the southern United States and you're about my age, you may remember back when everything was closed on Sundays. And if you suddenly needed to get out of town or travel across the country on a Sunday, and you were leaving, from the southern U.S., you were out of luck, because you wouldn't find gas stations open. So that's kind of what he's referring to here. You're going to be at a disadvantage if this occurs at a time when you're not going to be able to get stuff. So he's just trying to let us know that, again, when this occurs, this is the sign that things are about to get very, very, very bad. And you need to leave. You need to leave your home and escape. Let's finish up now by looking at verses 21 and 22. Why do we need to escape? He says, for at that time there will be great distress, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short because of the elect. So here we know he's talking about the end times. He says, because at this time, the world is going to be under so much distress that this will literally be the worst time in Earth's entire history. There won't be any distress like this ever before in the history of the earth or ever after in the history of the earth. Again, this is during a time called the Tribulation. And the Tribulation is a 7-year period of God's judgment on the earth. God is going to unleash his fury at people because of their sin. If you read the book of Revelation, there's one point in it where a quarter of the population is destroyed. And then later on, another period when a third of what's left is going to be destroyed. Billions of people are going to be killed during this time. Jesus says here it's going to be so bad that God's limiting it to only 7 years. And the reason he's limiting it to only 7 years is because if it lasted any longer, everybody would be killed. But he's going to cut it short. Why? Because of the elect, because of the Christians. Well, who are the elect during this time? My belief is that before the tribulation begins, all of us who are alive, as Paul talks about in Thessalonians, are going to be taken away from earth to heaven. All of the Christians who have already died will be resurrected and given their glorified bodies. All of us who are alive will be taken away and given our glorified bodies. This is an event called the Rapture. And I believe this will occur before the tribulation. And I'll tell you a little bit why here in just a minute. But they'll all be taken away. The church will be gone. So, during this 7-year period, at the very beginning of it, there will be no believing Christians on the earth. But during this 7 years, a lot of people are going to come to Christ. Because either they thought they were Christians and they know what's going on, so they finally accept Christ for real, or they're witnessed to by other Christians, or they realize that this is the wrath of God and they cry out to God themselves. But God is still going to be saving people during this time. God is still going to be bringing people to Christ during this time. And all of these people are still going to be alive, or not all of them, but many of them are still going to be alive at the end. We do know there's going to be a great persecution of Christians during the tribulation. So this elect that he's talking about are the Christians that are still going to be alive when Jesus returns. Now, when Jesus returns, in Revelation 19 and 20, it says he will come out of the sky riding his horse, his white horse, and the armies of heaven will be behind him. I believe that'll be those of us whose bodies were taken up during the rapture, all of the Christians who had lived before the tribulation. And we're going to come down with him, but it says a sword will come out of his mouth, representing the word of God. With just a word, Jesus is going to kill everyone who is not a believer when he returns. You'll say, isn't that a little bit harsh? Yes. But the Bible says the wages of sin is death. And again, this is God's wrath. Everyone will have had a chance to accept Christ. And if you refuse, then you're accepting the penalty. So when Jesus returns, what that means is the only people left on earth, and this is why I believe the rapture has to be before, the only people left on earth are those who became Christians during the tribulation, and they will still be normal, regular people. So after Jesus returns, during what's called the Millennial Kingdom, when Jesus rules from Jerusalem as king of earth for 1,000 years, there's going to be two kinds of people on earth. There's going to be the mortals, those who were saved during the tribulation and then continued to live their lives afterwards, got married, had kids, kids grew up, they died off, the kids had kids, and so on. Remember, this is going to last for 1,000 years. There's going to be several generations going through here. And earth is going to repopulate because of these people. But then there will also be the immortals, those of us who returned with Jesus, who already have our glorified immortal bodies. The Bible says we're going to be the rulers over these people. We're going to be the local governors and mayors and the officials in charge, with Jesus as the high king. And that's why I think the rapture has to be before the tribulation, because if the rapture comes after the tribulation, like some think, that means everybody would have a glorified body, everybody would have an immortal body, there won't be any people to rule over. So, that's what I think is going to happen. You can disagree with me if you want to, but that's what I believe. And that's why I think it says the time is going to be cut short because of the elect. There still has to be some Christians left alive when Jesus returns, so that they can repopulate the world. Now we're going to go more into that. I'm planning on making a video discussing the rapture, the millennium later on, so look forward to that. Hopefully I can get that done here within the next week or so. Pray for me to do that. Next week, we're going to get into what will actually happen when Jesus returns. How are we going to recognize the real Jesus when he comes back? Again, if you enjoy these videos, like, subscribe. Please leave comments. Let me know what you think. I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to know how many people are actually watching these, and if you enjoy them. So, stay tuned for next week's video, and I will see you then.